Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Bajer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It explores how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. It looks at how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
The successful companies, the one that survived and continuing to do well now, are characterized by being small. They often only have about 500 employees. They may have lots of kind of part-time employees, but the core of it is a very small company of organization of about 500 people. It has a family ethos to it, a village ethos or community ethos, as you described it. They have a very clear sense of purpose and that they're there to kind of not just make a profit, but also to do some kind of good for society, some kind of benefits for society. But also they have a long-term vision, and it's not a short-term vision driven by the investors who want their money as quickly as possible. They are prepared to go slowly.
Hello, and welcome to episode 94 of the Culture Lab podcast. This episode is brought to you by CultureBrained, a one-of-a-kind global community for leaders and culture champions who want to learn new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures at scale in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. The CultureBrained community is where we come together to answer some pretty darn hard ungoogleable questions about culture. And our members get to participate in things like weekly huddles, masterclasses, flash mastermind groups, and talks from world-class experts on culture. And you know many of these experts from this podcast. But most importantly, we facilitate deep peer-to-peer connections. Because making work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, it's definitely not a task for a single person. It requires tapping into the collective wisdom of bold, kind, and curious culture leaders who are on a mission to redefine and, frankly, decrapify work. So, if this sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, check it out at tiny.1/CultureBrained. And don't worry, you don't have to write it down. There is a link in the show notes. Today, my guest is Robin Dunbar. Robin Dunbar is a professor of evolutionary psychology at Oxford University. He has spent most of his career trying to answer a deceptively simple question. How and why did humans evolve to be such a sociable species? He's perhaps best known for the so-called Dunbar's number, the idea that there is an upper limit to the number of meaningful social relationships that we can maintain. And it's an idea which seems to hold true at work as well, even now in the era of remote and hybrid work. Because, well, theoretically, we can connect with anyone, anywhere, thanks to our cool technological tools. It seems that cultivating relationships, remotely or not, is still a matter of spending some quality time together. And this is a limited resource for all of us. In this interview, Professor Dunbar and I talk about how we can apply the findings from his research when we design our teams and our organizations. We also talk about why the number 150 is so incredibly important to keep in mind when we build a business. We talk about his forecasts when it comes to the return or no return to the office, and so much more. I really hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I did.
So I'm Robin Dunbar. I'm Professor of Evolutionary Psychology at the University of Oxford in England, and I've spent my research career studying human social organizations and human relationships.
I am thrilled to have you on the show, Professor Dunbar. The first question that I have for you is, what were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person?
Well, actually, I grew up in East Africa, which was an incredibly multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic society. And because it was a small population, was actually really surprisingly well integrated, considering the period this was 70 years ago nearly. So I grew up as a bilingual in Kiswahili and English, and deeply immersed in different human cultures from both East Africa and from India and Arabia in this sort of extraordinary melting pot. Those, I think, were very formative experiences for me, although at the time I didn't appreciate them. But looking back, I see that it allowed me to sit comfortably within almost any cultural grouping and see the world from that culture's point of view rather than looking in as an outsider, which is so often, of course, the case. So that was very important. But when I went to university, I went to study philosophy, and that was the only thing I was interested in. But because I couldn't study philosophy on its own at the university I went to, I chose to study it with psychology as the least bad option because I had no idea what psychology was. And my background was completely in the humanities, not the sciences. But psychology introduced me to the sciences, and it turned me into a scientist, if you like. But because of my background in philosophy, it also meant that I could integrate many different fields of science. So, if you like, kind of multicultural and multi-scientific, in that I work across many different disciplines of science quite happily because of this early experience, if you like.
And I know that you spent 6 years living with 500 gelada monkeys in a really remote region of Ethiopian highlands. What did you learn by observing their social lives?
Yes, we spent a very long time studying these rather spectacular monkeys in northern Ethiopia. And these monkeys only occur in northern Ethiopia at very high altitudes, above 2,000 meters in altitude. I think the thing that I really learned from them is how to understand a very complex, multi-layered social system, because and not only do they live in very large groups, but these are very highly structured groups with many different components that fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, if you like, and are very different to the kinds of much simpler societies that most monkeys and apes have, where there's just a single group rather than multiple levels of grouping. And these are very ecologically very simple species, but socially extremely complex. And they really laid the groundwork for much of the work I've done on monkeys and primates in general, and then later humans, right from the outset, because it was kind of having to try and understand this very complex social system that made me think about many different aspects of their ecology and biology.
What made you turn your focus from monkeys to humans?
Mrs. Thatcher.
Really, I had no idea that she had such great contributions to science. That's amazing.
Yeah, she didn't realize it, but it was her fault. It just so happened that around the middle of the 1980s, there was a big economic slump. And so the government, Mrs. Thatcher's government, had imposed many restrictions on the universities and limited the amount of money available for funding research in universities. And at that point, it was just not possible to get money to go back to places like Africa to study wildlife. So I just started a new job at that time, in fact, in London. And I thought, what can I do if I can't go to Africa? And of course, also, it was a lecturing job. So I had to spend, of course, the term times at the university teaching students. What kind of research can I do? And I had the idea of just studying humans in the street in the same way as we study monkeys. The human work all studied from there. But I realized now, looking back on this, that my inclination to do that was much influenced by my early experience living among many different cultures and ethnicities in East Africa, in that I always found the kind of cultural differences fascinating, even as a child. And so trying to understand those cultural differences was a kind of obvious next step. If we can ask questions about why do monkey species differ in their behavior, then we can ask why do human cultures differ in their behavior in the same kind of way. And that was very, very illuminating. And it was just at that point that many people were starting to bring a scientific, biological perspective to the study of human cultures.
What surprised you most in your early findings as you were transitioning from observing monkeys to observing human beings? What made you go, oh, really? I didn't realize that it's true. What was it?
Yes, there was just such a moment at that point which really reinforced that switch to humans and made humans much more interesting, if you like. And that was the discovery that there is really quite a simple relationship between the size of social groups in monkeys and apes and the size of their brains. I wasn't actually trying to test for that. I was trying to solve another problem about monkey behavior, which is why they spend so much time grooming each other, leafing through the fur to remove bits of leaves and so on. And I had the idea that grooming was related to creating friendships, if you like, social bonds, which is what I'd learnt really from studying the gelada monkeys in Ethiopia. Then it ought to correlate with the size of their brains, because the suggestion had then just been made that the reason primates have big brains is because they live in complicated societies. They need a big computer to manage all the relationships. And so I looked at the relationship between brain size and group size across species of monkeys and apes. And sure enough, there was a relationship. And then that made me think, well, we actually have in the same database brain size data for humans. Let's see what this relationship predicts for humans. And the number that equation, the monkey and ape equation, predicted for humans was 150. And I thought that was really very small. But I went to the library and spent many days in the library looking for data in small-scale traditional societies, hunter-gatherer type societies, on natural grouping sizes in these small-scale societies. And it turned out that, in fact, 150 was very close to the typical size of one grouping layer, which we can think of as a kind of clan or a local community in these kinds of societies. So these kinds of traditional small-scale societies, they're similar to ours in that they have many layers. So you have a family embedded in a kind of extended family, which is embedded in a village, which is embedded in a local region, that kind of hierarchical layering. And it was one of these layers corresponded almost exactly to the figure of 150. And then after that, I kind of started very seriously looking for both to see whether this number was really true in other contexts. For example, was it also true in our own personal social networks? If we looked at the number of friends and family, extended family that someone has, is that also about 150? And how do we create those social groups, the relationships that allow those groups to be stable through time, to the bonding processes, both at the cognitive level and at the equivalent of grooming, as it were, in monkeys and apes. So, that created 25 years of very busy research in looking at many different fields to look at different aspects of how both personal social networks work, but also trying to look at how organizations work in the same context.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about these numbers. I've heard that human beings are so reliant on social collaboration that our bodies have actually evolved this feeling of loneliness almost as an alarm system. So we are wired to avoid isolation. And so obviously we need meaningful relationships in our lives for our psychological well-being. So my question to you is, what are the upper limits to creating meaningful relationships with other people? Because you've mentioned that number, 150, as a number of the size of a clan or a tribe. So I want to ask, can we have a meaningful relationship with 150 people, or is it too many already?
The answer to that question is, I think that the 150 is about meaningful relationships. That's to say, relationships where you know the person well, you've known them for some time, maybe all your life even. You know where they stand in your social world, they know where you stand in their social world, and those two views match, if you like. So the big difference here is between people in that 150 circle and the people who lie just outside it, because the next circle out goes out to about 500 people, and all the people between 150 and 500 are what we might think of as acquaintances. Now, many of those people you will know them from work, maybe. You might even go and have a beer with them after work, perhaps. But you probably wouldn't invite them to your home. And you certainly wouldn't invite them to your big birthday party. That's for sure. And many of those relationships in that outer circle will also be one way. So you may know them quite well, but they perhaps don't know you so well. Sometimes people in that circle are simply people that you're very familiar with from the television. So probably for all of us, whether we like it or not, Mr. Trump sits in our circle out there because we've seen him so often on the television. But if we bumped into him in the street, we would recognize him. But if we went up to him and said, "Oh, Donald, lovely to see you. Come and have a beer with me," he would look very surprised. And so the big difference is between the fact that you know them, but they don't know you in those kind of outer relationships, and the inner relationships where if he really was a friend of yours, but you haven't seen him for many years, maybe he would say, "Oh, great, let's go and catch up." But these are kind of like a cooperative extended network rather than intimate relationships. So if you look at the structure of social networks, they have a very clearly tiered, layered structure to them. And these layers occur at very specific numbers. So there's an inner layer at about 5 people, and then a layer at about 15. That these layers count cumulatively. So the 15 includes the 5 people. Then there's a layer at 50, another layer at 150. Beyond that, a layer, as I mentioned already, at 500, and then another layer at 1,500. These numbers have a very specific pattern that each layer is 3 times the size of the layer inside it. But the ones that really matter, now, for most of us in the modern world with small families, half of those people in the 150 are extended family. We're related to them as family. And half are, if you like, true friends. In small-scale societies where people still have very large families, maybe 8 or 9 children, then all the 150 will be family. We give preference to family always. And if it's only if we have some slots left over because we've run out of family that we find friends to fill the empty holes, if you like. Now, the difference between these layers really reflects both the intimacy of the relationship and the frequency with which you contact them, but also how willing you are to help them out and the kinds of benefits they provide you with. In this context, the most important layer is the innermost layer of 5. We sometimes call them the shoulders to cry on friends, because they're the ones who, when your world completely falls apart, everything's a disaster, they're the ones who will drop everything and come and pick you up and put you back on your feet and comfort you and help you out and so on. And those relationships are very costly to maintain. We have to devote about 40% of our total social time, our social capital, if you like, to maintaining those 5 relationships.
Wow, that sounds like a lot.
It's about half an hour a day each. On average, But what's interesting is that typically for those, particularly the inner 2 circles, the 5 layer and the 15 layer, they really do consist of half friends and half family. What we tend to find is the next layer out, the 50 layer, consists mainly of friends. And then the outermost layer, the 150 layer, consists mainly of extended family, because we don't have to invest so heavily in family to maintain the relationships. That's the key to it. So we can be a bit give them a bit less effort, and they still will invite us to dinner.
Yes. So how do these numbers, how can they inform the way we design our organizations and the way we work? Because it seems like, we know that deep, meaningful relationships at work are really important. There's data that shows that people who have a best friend at work, they are happier with their jobs and more productive. And there's plenty of data around belonging at work. It seems to increase job performance, if I recall correctly, by something like 56%. It reduces turnover. It decreases sick days by 75%. So we have evidence that shows us that having deep relationships at work is important. But then, of course, we cannot rely on these relationships just being created spontaneously. So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on how we can design organizations to help teams to really leverage what we know about how people connect?
Okay, I think there are two separate issues here. One is the actual size of your groupings within the organization. So these layers with their very specific numbers are based on kind of how well you know somebody, and therefore they have important implications for the size of things like committees or work groups or departments, even in organizations, that reflect the amount of not intimate knowledge is the wrong word, but understanding how somebody else is thinking for the task in hand. So if you want a committee, for example, to come to a decision quickly, then you're much better off with about 4 or 5 people in the committee, and particularly people that know each other well and have the same perspectives, if you like. They will come to a decision much, much more quickly, and they're much more likely to come to the right one. And that's partly because they don't have to explain everything to everybody else. They understand immediately what you mean when you say X or Y or Z. You don't have to explain what this is all about, and therefore waste a lot of time. The discussion can just get on and get to the meat of the problem. But if you want, on the other hand, a committee that kind of throws ideas about and explores new possibilities, then it's much better to have a committee of about 12 or 15 people so that you have more diversity in there. The same principles seem to apply more generally in terms of, let's say, departmental organization or something like that. If you have them about the size of these numbers, then they seem to work better together and have less friction and less likelihood that differences of opinion will cause people to fall out with each other and bad feelings to arise. This is particularly so with the 150, and a very nice example of that is Gore-Tex, the company that makes the waterproof material, which probably all of us are wearing somewhere, if not in our shoes, certainly in our clothing, and even was in the space suits of the astronauts who landed on the moon. So it's a very, very successful, smallish company. It's not a big multinational at all. It's quite a small company still, and owned by the family, I think, still. But when Willard Gore set it up, having worked for the DuPont chemical multinational, he decided, when he discovered the process for making this material, he decided that the problem with these big companies was they were very dysfunctional because they were just too large, and rivalries built up and so on between different parts of the company. And that he figured out, actually mathematically, that the best size, the optimal size, was about 150. And he then designed the structure of the company into what he called, and they still call, a flat lattice management system. So instead of having a hierarchical management system with the board at the top and the CEO at the pinnacle, and then sort of more and more people in layers, they simply had a whole set of completely independent small factory units, or sometimes they're administrative units rather than factory units. But if they wanted to expand a factory because orders were increasing, instead of making the factory bigger, which is what every company normally does. They would build a new factory, sometimes on the parking lot right next door, but the two factories would then be completely independent. They were given their targets by the board. It was up to the factory how they implemented these and how they did it. But because their size was small, always below 200, ideally about 150, and never in buildings with more than 2 floors. So you could get upstairs very easily to see somebody else.
Which brings us to this question around what do we do when we can't have that physical proximity? Which, of course, is the big question for everyone right now in this context of remote and hybrid work, because not only we cannot be in the same factory or on 2 different floors, very often we cannot be in the same country.
Right. Yes. This has been the great seismic change, really, of the last a year or so, hasn't it, as a result of the pandemic. And of course, for a lot of people who have to perhaps commute to work a long distance in very crowded trains or on very busy roads, it's a great blessing to be able to stay at home for a few days and perhaps take the children to school for once and have a little bit more relaxed day. And I'm sure there are benefits in that. Of course, we need to remember that that's only possible for certain kinds of office workers. There are some poor people who can't do that. They have to go in every day, and that includes, the receptionist who has to be at the front door, or the building cleaners, or whatever it may be, but also, of course, people in hospitals and many other jobs like that. There's no way they can work in a hybrid environment. So those who can should regard it as a real privilege, that's for sure. But I think the problem here is, like everything in life, there's no such place as nirvana. Everything has costs and benefits. The benefits are very clear for people who can have hybrid working. Life is more relaxing for them, and it's good to take advantage of that. But at the same time, there are costs to bear in terms of the organization. And that's what I think the organization needs to worry about. There's now quite a lot of evidence from studying what happened during lockdown, during the pandemic, that there's a tendency for casual relationships to happen when you're not in work. So when you're working at home, there's a tendency, one study, for example, has looked at email traffic within a large organization. And what they found was that, yes, within the small groups, this was actually a research university, within the small research groups, there was just the same amount of emailing going backwards and forwards as there always had been. But what happened was there was a great reduction in the number of emails with people outside the research group. And what they were losing were the casual contacts that happened round the water cooler, as I sometimes describe it. So perhaps you go to a meeting or a seminar or something, and you meet by chance people from other parts of the organization or from elsewhere, or perhaps you just bump into somebody over the water cooler and you start a casual conversation with them. Suddenly you realize that the person and the department they come from is very important for what you do. And so you make a big effort. And it's those casual relationships which are lost. And the problem is it's those casual relationships that create innovations and new research directions, new product directions, and so on. So that flow of information around the system is what is lost. And that can, becomes a big drag for an organization, particularly a business, which is creating and manufacturing new products, because suddenly the casual contacts that produce new ideas don't happen anymore. And that's what we really need to worry about. And the most important in this context, really, it seems to be, is just the opportunity to meet people over lunch. It's just a very, very good place. So, there was a fashion in the last few decades for architects to, remove cafeterias and restaurants because we don't need them anymore. People can bring sandwiches to work. But actually, the places that have made a big effort to keep their work restaurants going, and to provide kind of cheap food that will attract people to come, find that casual contacts emerge and in the dining room, if you like, just because people happen to be sitting next to each other and get into conversation. And, one thing that's worth remembering in this context, we actually have tried this once before in the 1990s and early 2000s, because in the big cities, the big companies at the time, property, real estate and rentals in big cities like London and Paris and so on were getting extremely expensive. So they thought, well, now we have technology, we can give everybody a computer and they can go and sit in their dacha in the countryside, and we can have virtual conferences online and so on. This is when these possibilities first became possible. And what they found was that people somehow drift away. They lose a sense of belonging to the organization. They lose a sense of the purpose of the organization. And it's very easy for people to kind of slip between the cracks and the system not to work very well. So within about 10 years, people came back into the office again. And I have one more example of this, which is worth mentioning, which I always think is very nice, is there was one of the big European multinationals was trying to reorganize its headquarters buildings in the UK because they were scattered over quite a wide area, and they built a new campus with combined all these different headquarters buildings. And they spent a lot of time and effort talking to everybody and explaining what they were doing and saying, look, the way we're going to do it is the campus will be much smaller, but we're giving all of you a laptop. You can go and work at home as much as you want. When you come in, you just come in when you have a meeting. You can hot desk, but we'll give you a nice restaurant to eat in. There will be nice shops, a gymnasium to go and exercise in, all these kind of benefits. And they thought they would have most trouble with the older generation who would say, but I want my special office with a very thick carpet and expensive furniture. And the younger generation would be saying, oh, this is great. We'd rather work at home. And they were absolutely astounded to discover it was quite the reverse. The older generation said, great, I don't have the stress of coming in. I can relax much more. This is really the important point. The younger generation all said, what do you mean we can't come into work? We come into work to meet our friends. And I think what everybody had forgotten is that the world of work, it's a social world. That's what makes it work well, because people know and understand each other. But because they talk to each other a lot, they become friends. And for younger generation, younger people who are moving to a new city maybe, or people moving from abroad, perhaps to your company from a different country, coming to your country to work in your organization, they don't know anybody outside work, and it can take a long time to make friends out there in the civilian world, as we might say. Whereas you have a kind of ready-made pool of friends at work. And a lot of them, if they don't have those friends to support them, then you get loneliness that you mentioned already at the beginning. Then you get depression and more illness and less efficient working, particularly by the younger generation. And we already know that's a problem because, loneliness has been a major pandemic in young graduates. Yes, and that's true, but it's not just the UK. I mean, it's the America's had to say it's where the population is mobile, where the population doesn't move so much for jobs, then you don't get these problems because people have their home neighborhoods and their home connections, their home friends and their home family and so on. But where people move a lot, which is what tends to happen increasingly in the kind of Western European and North American worlds, then you end up with, this group of people who just don't know anybody. And if they don't have the opportunity to make friends at work, they're left completely on their own. And the company, never mind the country, pays a terrible price in terms of inefficient working and many days of sickness and so on.
And the individuals, of course, pay a personal price. I'm sure that you know about this research, I cannot recall who did it, about our 2 a.m. friends. And basically, the idea is that a healthy person, a person who has a healthy social cycle, will have 5 people whom they could call at 2 a.m. when their whole world comes crashing down. And basically, what we learn from this research is that there is a huge portion of population right now, especially in the Western world, that doesn't have that circle of 5 people. And obviously, that's a huge problem for our society.
Yes, exactly so.
So, Professor Dunbar, I'm curious, both from the point of view of what's happening to us in our societies, but also, and I think especially in the workplace, what is your forecast? Where are we going? And what is the future when it comes to human connections at work?
I think the bottom line here is that big organizations, whether it's a business, a government department, a hospital, schools, or universities, any of these big organizations need to start thinking much more carefully about how they organize their internal arrangements, social arrangements, if you like, for their staff. Both in the end, of course, for all businesses, the single most important thing is, do you make a profit? That's what it's there for, right? And if a business doesn't make a profit, it will go bust, of course. So that's its bottom line. But businesses kind of have to, I think, appreciate more than has been the case in certainly the last 50 years or 100 years maybe, that in order to make a profit, you have to have a workforce that is contented with itself and is happy. A happy workforce works better and is sick less often, is the bottom line here. So they need to look at these things very carefully. And part and parcel of that is the whole issue of hybrid working, the trade-offs involved. And they need to find solutions to the rather difficult problems of how to mix and match these things so that it works effectively and is fair to everybody. Because, as I said, how does the doorkeeper feel when the doorkeeper has to come in every day, but he knows that all the office workers upstairs only come in, 3 days a week? The doorkeeper is going to feel unhappy and aggrieved. So they need to figure out how to do this. And I think what's interesting, actually, I think, is a lot of the Silicon Valley companies have kind of been aware of these problems for some time. And they've been engaging or developing kind of strategic things to do at a social level that have probably been quite helpful in creating a sense of belonging. And there's 2 things that are important here. One is creating this sense of belonging to the company. The company has a purpose. The organization has a purpose. And that purpose is a good purpose because it has a social benefit in some way. And there is a kind of sense of family about it, a sense of the village. We all belong to this village. And here's the story of how we were founded and so on. So creating those senses is important. There's a very nice study done by somebody in the UK a couple of years ago, which compared companies which he called centenary companies on the London Stock Exchange that had been around for over 100 years, and comparing them with companies which hadn't, because the turnover on stock exchange companies is, in both America and in Europe, has been very, very high. Lots of big famous companies have disappeared in the last 30 years. And what he found was that the successful companies, the one that survived and continuing to do well now, are characterized by being small. They often only have about 500 employees. They may have lots of kind of part-time employees, but the core of it is a very small company organization of about 500 people. It has a family ethos to it, a village ethos or community ethos, as you described it. They have a very clear sense of purpose, and that they're there to kind of not just make a profit, but also to do some kind of good for society, some kind of benefits for society. But also they have a long-term vision, and it's not a short-term vision driven by the investors who want their money as quickly as possible. They are prepared to go slowly, like the tortoise in the fairy tale, as it were, go slowly and win because the hare or the rabbit exhausts itself and dies on the road, And that, I think, is a very strong lesson for us. What makes a company work or any organization, not just businesses, any organization work and work effectively is having this sense of being a community to which we feel proud to belong as the workers in it. And you look at the Japanese as a particularly good example of this, certainly in their heyday in the 70s and 80s and of the motor industry, when they were dominating the world in the motor industry and in electronics. If you looked at the workers there, they had this incredible loyalty to the company. I'm a company man, that is the term they used. And I belong to the company from cradle to grave, from the day I'm born to the day I die. And this sense of loyalty to the company, which they've kind of broken because they've looked at efficiencies in businesses in America and other places and kind of go, well, maybe we're doing it wrong. I think they were doing it right. And I think they're paying a price somewhat now for having lost that sense of belonging. So we have to worry about those kind of things probably much more than people have done in the past.
Yes, and it's quite a challenging thing to do right now because there are these two opposing schools of thought. One group of people definitely say that there is no going back, that hybrid is here to stay, and we are definitely not going back to the office. And the other one say, well, we really need to meet in person. And I think predominantly you hear CEOs and senior executives saying we will really need to come back to the office in order to have these serendipitous encounters with others that fuel innovation and fuel a sense of belonging. And I find this conversation and this debate incredibly fascinating. It seems to be a very, very emotional issue for a lot of people too. I'm not sure if you've heard the interview with Malcolm Gladwell. There's this podcast called The Diary of a CEO. So he talked about the fact that people should go back to the office. So Gladwell talked about that. And the backlash that he got was just unbelievable, just because he stated his opinion. And, I would really encourage everyone who's listening to our conversation to go on YouTube, find this interview, and just read the comments. I think you will be shocked. It's astonishing how people don't want to go back to the office. So I think we're really faced with a huge challenge here.
Yeah. Unfortunately, history is not on the side of the objectors, if you like, because as I said before, we tried this about 30 years ago, and within 10 years, everybody was back in the office, not because the CEO said you must all come back into the office or we won't pay you, but because people wanted to come back into the office because of this partly the social benefits, but also in terms of, particularly, I think, for creative kinds of work, the capacity to actually meet face to face is so important. And it is obviously important. Partly you yearn for the fun of being around people, but also you kind of go, it's really not very easy to discuss these things at the end of a computer cable. I need to see the person. We need to sit down with a piece of paper in front of us on the table and draw out the things. And so people just started to go back in of their own volition, I think. I mean, it wasn't forced on them. And I think that's what will happen in the end. Because, we don't go into work because we have to, if you like. We go into work because we have pride in our job and we want to do a good job. And when it starts to become obvious that it's not working very well in terms of producing, doing a good job, then, people are proud of their jobs. They want to do it better and do it properly. And so they make the arrangements necessary to do that. And that will be very often going back into work. It's all very well for those who say, no, hybrid working is here to stay. My answer to that is simply look at history.
Yeah, well, let's see. It's going to be really interesting, I think. I've personally seen a lot of companies that have been incredibly successful throughout the pandemic. And so they've decided to remain remote as a result. And they just found a different cadence to how they meet in person. So they still do meet in person. For example, they have frequent meetings where they are co-working for a whole week. They will go somewhere and the whole team comes together and they spend a whole week in something like almost a residential program, really, where they work together for 5 days or 7 days or whatever it is. And then they have some meetings of 2 days where there is this intense time spent on brainstorming, but the rest of the work is actually done remotely. So I think we might see a lot of these setups that haven't been tested in the past, I think. But I'm super curious what the future is going to show us. We probably can't really forecast with any amount of accuracy.
That is clearly what's needed. I mean, a lot of very creative thinking is needed in the management as to how to manage this, because there are advantages to home working. I work in a sector, if you like, where hybrid working has been the norm for decades, yes, half a century at the very least. In academia, the lecturing and research side of academia, at least, staff often work at home because they don't get the telephone bothering them and all these other things when they need to perhaps get something done. But I'm very conscious of the fact that even so, there are still people that have to come in every day, whether they like it or not. And so it's a kind of unfair system, which it risks breeding unhappiness in that context. But it's possible to find ways of doing this, of the kind you suggest there. It just needs very, very careful thinking about. The problem that we have to be aware of, though, is simply that video technology, as good as it is not a complete solution to the business of maintaining contact, because we don't find, if you like, interactions via digital media anything like as satisfying as face-to-face interactions. The dynamics of face-to-face interactions are very peculiar. And this has consequences for the way Zoom meetings, for example, happen, or any kind of video-based meetings, is because we cannot have more than 4 people in a conversation at a time. What would normally happen in a larger meeting is you'd end up with lots of small conversations going on and people moving from one conversation to another. You cannot do that very easily on Zoom. And Zoom, therefore, tends to get dominated by the 4 people with the loudest voices. And then everybody else sits in the background and checks their news feed and their emails and looks at the cat out of the window and so on. These kind of things.
There are technologies now being developed, and some of them work pretty well. I was surprised. But obviously, it's not the same as face-to-face meeting, face-to-face interaction. And so I agree.
It's the person-to-person contact. And in the end, it's the capacity to put your hand on somebody's shoulder, if you like, and express that level of intimacy and pleasure of interacting with somebody that creates this sense of bonding and willingness to help somebody else out and so on. These things we cannot do online, and they are very, very important in our social life, everyday social life. They work in important ways in our work life as well. And the other problem that's worth highlighting with Zoom, I shouldn't be blaming Zoom because it's all these different environments. It's extremely difficult to meet and come to know people anew when it's done purely online. It just somehow doesn't seem to work. And this is basically what people found over lockdown. They would have many Zoom meetings with their family or their friends or even with work colleagues, but they worked okay with people you know. But it's an extremely difficult environment to introduce somebody new into a group. And what was interesting about it, I think, is the general perception that it worked very well with family members, but it didn't work so well with friends, that somehow there was just something missing that in a family context didn't matter so much, but even in just a friend's context, kind of just didn't make it work so well. The real problem is, how do you get somebody to be part of an organization when they join online? And so far, there seems to be no solution to that. There is nothing like face-to-face contact doing that.
And onboarding, yeah, it's one of the many challenges.
Many people during lockdown joined an organization with a new job, and then they left months later without ever having met the other people in their group except online. And they had no sense of belonging, no sense of commitment to the other members of the organization or their particular department.
And at the same time, I also want to highlight, because I do know that there are some organizations that have actually been quite successful in onboarding their new team members virtually. And when you look at their retention numbers and also the level of engagement that their employees expressed, they do have a sense of belonging. And actually, the level of satisfaction, the level of engagement has gone up. So I think one of the great examples that comes to mind is Spotify. They were one of the pioneers when it came to work from anywhere policy. One of the first companies that said, okay, this policy is available to everyone. You can move if you want. You can work from anywhere. And their financial results have been better since they did that. And their employee engagement looks better as well. And their people, they say they love it. And their onboarding program seems to be working really well. Of course, we don't know what the long-term impact is going to be, you might say. And so there's something that remains to be seen. But I don't want us not to mention these companies that actually have had a lot of success with those things.
Yeah, I think the message here is this is not a simple problem. It's not a problem that's insoluble. The great thing about humans is once they understand what the problem is, they're very, very good at finding solutions, whether those are technical solutions or other kinds of solutions. We're really quite good at doing that. It's just that we need to understand what the issue is. And the message, I think, is simply don't assume that it's easy and you can just say, oh, okay, go and work at home. You need to invest a lot of time in thinking it through and planning and having these mechanisms available for creating this sense of belonging to the company. And this is maybe why Spotify is successful. Maybe my guess is it's actually quite a small company compared with some of the big multinationals. And that will be important because feeling that you belong to a special small group seems to work very well with us.
They are not that small. I mean, of course, it's relative, but they are definitely not as big as Google or Amazon with hundreds of thousands of people, but they are a global company. I don't know exactly the number, but it's definitely not that small. We are talking about thousands of people, and I think they're close to 10,000. But I think that the key message here, I absolutely agree, is that we need to think about those things really carefully. And I think it's a perfect segue, actually, to the next section of the show, where we take questions from our community members. And I have a question for you from Dorota Piotrkowska, who's one of our CultureBrained community member.
Hello, Professor Dunbar. My name is Dorota Piotrkowska, and I've been a passionate people and organization development professional for around 20 years. And I'd love to hear if there is any research, or if you could maybe add something from your perspective to the question of the so-called bonding versus bridging relations formed in, I'd say, first and foremost, a remote environment or hybrid environment. As we know from the organization and network analysis research, it's so much easier to form those intra-team bonding relations, and it's so much more difficult to form, sustain, and foster those cross-team relations in hybrid and remote environment. And it's, of course, very, very, very much a challenge, especially for innovative tech organizations. Curious to hear if there is any way we can influence those, especially bridging relationships, and if there is any research on that. Thank you very much for entertaining my question.
That's a very interesting question, actually, Dorota. I'm not sure we actually know the answer. I certainly don't, but I'm not sure that there is a sort of made-to-measure answer on the table that you can just say, go away and do this, and it'll work. A lot is going to depend on the culture and location and nature of the organization. My sense, however, is that a lot of this comes down to feeling that you belong to a community, and it's enhancing those community membership components that of bonding, not in the networking sense of bonding, but just in the emotional sense of bonding. That's important. And the way we normally do that is often through storytelling origin storytelling. Here's the lone inventor who discovered this process and struggled to get it going and eventually succeeded. And these kind of stories, part of the fabric of long surviving companies. If you look at the Mars company, the chocolate makers in America, or Unilever, or many of these other big companies, they have...
WD-40 comes to mind. They have a very tribal culture.
Yeah. If you like, myths of foundation, those are important. But I think also, and this has been recognized for a very long time, that if you're going to have remote working, you've got to have contexts in which you can bring everybody together in order for them to bond with each other, basically get to know each other and bond. It changes the dynamics dramatically if you get a phone call from another part of your organization from somebody you know or you've met in the past, even if it's only briefly at some office party, maybe even. Your willingness to take time out to help them out or whatever it was they're ringing you up about really depends on whether you feel a sense of obligation towards them. And that comes either from person to person obligation or because there's a wider sense of obligation created by the organization. We all belong to the same organization. We're all fighting the same battle. We're all trying to be on the winning side. And therefore, I'm very busy, but I will give you my time to try and help solve your problem.
Yeah, we are a part of the same community.
Yes.
Absolutely. Again, it's definitely not a perfect substitute, but I've seen companies do things like creating random coffee meetings, the software that is pairing people up. Basically, you end up having coffee with someone from a different department, simply as a way to introduce people to each other across the organization. And the companies that do this, they actually say that it's working. Of course, it's not the same thing as sitting down for lunch with someone, but it's actually pretty good. I mean, compared to doing nothing, people say that they've met a lot of colleagues and they had really relaxed conversations with them. So the whole idea behind this is that it's not about work. It's not about discussing a project. It's about getting to know each other. And so, yeah, there are workarounds. They are not perfect, but there are things that we can do. Professor Dunbar, I would like to invite you to the final segment of the show. We call it a rapid fire questions section, where basically I'll ask you 5 questions in rapid succession. And the challenge here for you is to answer these questions in under 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll try.
You strike me as someone who really enjoys their work. And so my question to you is, if you were to identify the 3 main components of deep fun at work, what would they be and why?
That's actually rather complicated. I would say it's just having friendly relationships with the people you work with. But the important thing about that is the place you do it in. And so some very successful companies, for example, have, particularly brewers, will have a free pub where people can go and meet and have a beer with after work. And those have been very successful. And I think that's the bottom line. It's the situation and the event.
What are the signs that your company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
I think inefficiencies in the management of the subcomponent things. The big problem a lot of companies have had is outsourcing. And when they outsource stuff, they lose control over both quality and the pricing of those bits. And believe me, that's a disaster waiting to happen for companies in those contexts. They need to have much better sense of management over the whole process. And they just don't in the way that they often work now.
Are there any companies that you genuinely admire for their culture?
I would say Gore-Tex, in the way they've thought through and implemented the organization and structure of their business as a whole, their organization as a whole, that comes out number 1. But I'm also very impressed with companies, some of the Silicon Valley companies like Facebook, in the way they have arranged similar kinds of social events of the kind I'm talking about. So they will have a Wednesday afternoon or Wednesday evening get together in the courtyard in the center of the building as a social event where people can meet. And I think those are very, very important. And it's a culture you have to create because people have to make time for it.
Are there any books on philosophy, on culture, on leadership that you would recommend to our listeners?
I'd certainly recommend the book we're just writing right now. It's going to be out early in the new year. It's called The Social Brain, The Psychology of Organizations, because a lot of these ideas are spelled out in there. It's being published by Penguin, so it will be available fairly soon. And I would extol Gladwell's books in similar vein, because I think they're absolutely spot on.
So, final question. What can our listeners do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them bring their vision to life?
I think in the end, it all comes down to this problem of social bonding and creating a sense of belonging to the village, if you like, that makes up the organization. So it's kind of implementing occasions when people can meet in a relaxed social environment. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to sort of all go and play golf, which some of us would hate, even if, which is too many of these kind of events are organized like that. It's the kind of thing that somebody likes, or a small group of people like to do, but they forget that not everybody wants to do it. So kind of finding social contexts in which it's possible for people to meet casually like that and get to know each other better across department boundaries is the key to everything. And very often that's about eating together. Eating together is...
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say that. Yeah.
There are two things actually that I would recommend. One is eating together, but then you've got to make the food very good and very cheap. Better still if it's free. Otherwise, people will just eat their sandwiches at their desk. The other thing is singing. Singing we always refer to as the icebreaker effect, because you can turn a group of complete strangers into people who think they've known each other since the day they were born, just after 1 hour of singing together. And I don't mean singing Bach cantatas or fancy stuff. I just mean old-fashioned folk music round the campfire, that kind of singing together, fun singing. And it really bonds people very, very quickly. And those organizations that have introduced choirs for this specific purpose have found them very, very successful.
I haven't heard of it, but I've heard of research on how doing synchronized activities like rowing, dancing, and singing generally,
Yes.
how it helps people bond. But I had no idea that there were organizations who actually have choirs to help people bond. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. So if our listeners want to learn more about your upcoming book, about your work, are there any online places that people should go to?
My co-authors on this, Tracy Camilleri and Sam Rocky, are business consultants, and their business website, Harrison Thompson, if I've got the names the right way around, have a lot of this sort of stuff on it. But the book is actually online for pre-ordering now in all good online bookshops near you.
Fantastic. Well, definitely pre-order. And I can't wait. We need to have you back when the book is out.
Terrific.
So that we can talk about it. Terrific. Professor Dunbar, thank you so much for this conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. And I'm sure that our listeners are going to have a lot of fun listening to it. And I just want to say I'm so grateful for your work. It really had a huge impact on me, on my life, and on how I think about business, but also how I think about friendships and about building meaningful relationships and building communities. So I'm really, really grateful.
It's a great pleasure, Aga.
I'm Aga Bajer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast. And this is the Culture Lab team.
Anis Enlabarawi, production manager.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. Professor Dunbar and I hope that you get inspired by what he shared about cultivating human connections at work. And if you'd like an opportunity to interact with Professor Dunbar and other guests of the Culture Lab podcast, you might consider joining the CultureBrained community. CultureBrained is one-of-a-kind global community for culture leaders who look for new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. If you are in charge of a culture-shaping project, and if you believe that work should be synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, I think you'd feel right at home in our community. It's a really diverse group of culture leaders from Fortune 100 to tiny startups. And what brings us together is a passion for cultivating a healthy culture at scale. We are guided by our values of being bold, being kind, and being curious. And we'd love for you to join us, but only if it feels like the right thing for you. You can learn more about CultureBrained at tinyurl.com/CultureBrained. You'll find the link in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share this episode with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on any podcast streaming platform of your choice. If you want to receive our weekly insights on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: tinyurl.com/agabajer. That's tinyurl.com/AGABAJER. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it. And finally, the entire Culture Lab team and our guests, we are going to continue exploring how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, and how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing. So, what do you want to hear about next? What matters to you? Email us at lindsay@agabajer.com and let us know.